Let me tell you a story from my hometown. My family is from Xinjiang. My grandmother's home is in a village near Mulei County. It's a real mountain valley. When my mother was young, she was probably 4 or 5 years old. She didn't know much at that time. One night, my aunt asked my mother to steal vegetables from other people's vegetable gardens. The two of them went there. The moonlight was very bright, just like a street lamp. When they were about to crawl in through a half-person-high dog hole, they ran into a woman head-on. My aunt was in front and ran into her. My mother was behind. She only saw the woman's 2 long and black braids and the white rag clothes on her body. Then she was dragged by my aunt and ran away. They kept running and running. They ran to the roof of their house and sat down to rest, panting. Because they moved mountains to build houses, vegetable gardens are usually on the mountain behind their houses or next to them. At that time, my aunt asked my mother if she knew what that was. My mother said she didn't know. Then my aunt said it was a ghost. Think about it, there are no such people here, because everyone knows each other in the surrounding area. We know what vegetables our neighbors grow and how many sheep and cows they raise. So it's impossible that they don't know it. The next day, my aunt told my grandfather about it. My grandparents scolded them and didn't let them go out at night. Later, my grandfather asked others and said that a long time ago, a woman's head was chopped off on that wall. It was an uninvited guest. This happened when I was 3 years old. I already have a memory of it. To this day, I still remember it clearly. What happened that day was experienced by my mother and me. So I will tell it from my mother's perspective. I will add that at that time, my family rented a house from a Huey family. We lived in a bungalow. Across the street was a Huey cemetery. One day, my mother suddenly felt sleepy at around 11 a.m. She went to bed, but her sleep was not sound. When she was half asleep and half awake, she saw a woman with a red top, blue pants, shoes, braids, yellow skin, and spots on her face. She knocked 3 times on the main door, then came into my small door, knocked 3 more times, then walked straight to the window next to my bedroom, looked inside, said oh, she fell asleep and left. After my mother woke up, she asked the landlord's daughter if anyone had come. The landlord's daughter said no one. She had been watching TV at home and hadn't slept. If someone had come, she would have seen it. The next day, it was the same time, the same knock on the door, and the same words, but he was getting closer and closer to my window. On the 3rd day, even the head and shoulders were stretched in. My mother felt something was wrong after waking up, because 3 times is the limit. If she came in, it would be troublesome. She asked the landlord whether such a woman had died in the neighborhood in the past 3 years. The landlord's daughter said that the wife of one of his relatives had passed away a few months ago and usually dressed like this. Then the landlord used his elbow to nudge his daughter to stop him from talking. When my mother asked again, she didn't say anything and just said it was nothing. She remembered it wrong. My mother was also a fair person and didn't beat around the bush. She asked what your relative wanted to see us about. If he did this again, I would not be polite. The landlord heard it, but left without saying anything. My mother put mirrors on the doors and windows of my house. On the 4th day, at about 11 o'clock, my mother felt sleepy again. But this time, this woman walked into the front door and was about to knock on my door. She said and left. She never came back. Why do I say that my mother and I experienced this together? Because my mother was half asleep and half awake, and I was awake. I was eating biscuits and watching TV. Suddenly, I saw a woman crawling outside my window and looking inside. I was about to call my mother, but she suddenly disappeared. I didn't know at the time, but I thought there might be a bad person. Then, I didn't dare to watch TV. But the mineral water and biscuits had to be placed on the dressing table. The dressing table happened to be next to the window. I asked my mother if I could put the biscuits and mineral water on the bed. My mother said no in a daze. I suppressed my fear and rushed back to the bed and slept with my mother after putting them away. This incident lasted until I was a little older. When my mother complained about my family's poor living environment, we just met. The amazing thing is that my mother and I seem to have a telepathic connection. I can see what my mother dreams about. Sometimes my mother can also see what I dream about, people who cannot be seen. This story happened when my mother and father had just gotten married. My father was in the army. At that time, they lived in the army. One night, my parents came home very late. My father walked in front and my mother walked behind. There were actually no street lights on that road. But at that time, my mother saw that there were street lights on both sides of the road, which made the road very bright. Then 3 people came from the opposite side. A well-dressed young man and woman were holding an old lady. As they approached, the old lady suddenly asked my mother, "You guys are back so late." Then my mother said, "That's right. Auntie, why are you still going out so late? The road is not smooth. Please walk slowly." Then the old lady smiled and said, "Yes, I know," and walked away. My mother said that my father was rude. He ignored people who greeted us. My father didn't say anything and continued to walk forward. On the next morning, my father told my mother that he didn't see anyone last night. Only my mother was talking. And there were indeed no street lights on both sides of the road. Someone saw a hen eating with a group of chicks on this road at night. It was pitch black at night, but the chickens seemed to glow. Even every feather could be seen clearly. Long tongue. After I was born, when I was very young, one night, I didn't sleep and either cried or screamed. My mother asked me what was wrong. I closed my eyes tightly and pointed at the window and told my mother that there was a head that kept crawling into my mother's arms. My mother had already guessed what it was at this time. She comforted me and said, "Don't cry, baby. Tell me what you saw." I told my mother that I saw an old lady on the window with a very long tongue. My mother got angry and scolded me. She said, "You don't scare adults, but only scare children. What harm are you doing? If you scare my baby again, I will whip you with a whip and hit you with a jar of vinegar. You will never be reborn." After my mother scolded for a long time, I told my mother that there was no one. My mother stopped scolding me. The next night, my mother asked me what I saw again. I told my mother that there was no one, only the stars in the sky. I don't know if you have ever encountered such a weird experience. Well, this episode ends.